A warm September evening settled on New York's Upper West Side. At the Metropolitan Opera, an unusually hip crowd assembled for the night's main event. Shortly after 8 p.m., Chris Rock ascended to the main stage of the 1999 MTV Video Music Awards. Britney Spears transitioned to NSYNC. Eminem rapped with Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. The Backstreet Boys won a Viewer's Choice Award. During commercial breaks, Moby DJ'd for the audience. The 12 million viewers at home saw something even more special. Capitalizing on months of build-up, a minute-and-a-half-long commercial heralded the next generation of video games. The date was 9/9/1999, and at the price of $199 US, Sega launched the Dreamcast in America. Sega's sponsorship of the VMAs formed just one facet of an announced $100 million ad campaign. After a disappointing Japanese launch the year before, Sega of America needed a huge win for the Dreamcast to survive. By most metrics, launch day delivered. Hardware and software sales combined to almost $100 million within the first 24 hours. It was the biggest retail day for any entertainment product ever. Less than 2 years later, in January 2001, Sega held a conference call with an assembly of journalists. Peter Moore, president of the American subsidiary, announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast and Sega's exit from the console business. So, why did the Dreamcast fail? Money, as always. Sega could no longer afford to sell a games console. By the Dreamcast's American launch, Sega's corporate financials were in serious jeopardy. From 1993 onward, Sega's annual net income began a long slide downward. In 1998, it plunged into serious losses. The heady days of the Genesis were over. The transition to Saturn proved catastrophic. Released in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in the United States, the Saturn had to compete in an unfavorable market. Sega's user base was already fractured by the CD and 32X add-ons that eroded consumer confidence. The PlayStation quickly ate up the market share once claimed by the Genesis. The Genesis sold 20 million consoles in the United States. The Saturn, not even 2 million. In 1998, after 3 years of consoles sitting on store shelves, Sega discontinued the Saturn in America. Until the release of its next system in September 1999, Sega had no active presence in the American market. Meanwhile, Sega's consumer product sales were collapsing globally. The company stayed afloat with a $500 million personal loan from Isao Okawa, the billionaire chairman of Sega Enterprises. Sega had to pull off a spectacular success to reverse course and make up for the Saturn's poor performance. The way forward? Dreamcast. Fully acknowledging the faults of the Saturn, Sega engineered a truly next-generation system far ahead of the PlayStation and N64. It even came with a 56K dial-up modem, a truly revolutionary feature for a home console. The Dreamcast seemed to do everything right. It had to. Sony's PlayStation 2 was rumored to be on the horizon, and Nintendo would doubtless have a new system out eventually. Dreamcast had to move as many units as possible, to be in as many homes as possible, before its competition hit store shelves. Unfortunately for Sega, the Japanese launch in fall 1998 failed to meet expectations. With the exception of the newest Virtua Fighter, the launch lineup did not excite consumers. Still, the Dreamcast sold out, and may have sold more if not for manufacturing shortages. By March 1999, Dreamcast moved around 900,000 units in Japan. For the Dreamcast to survive, Sega executives wanted more than 1 million sold. Sega's corporate eyes then focused on America, the last greatest hope that the company had of staying in the console business. Blessed with almost a year until the American debut, Sega of America laid careful groundwork for the September 1999 release. More time meant more games. At launch, Japanese gamers could choose from 4 titles. Americans could pick from 24. And if anything would sell the Dreamcast, it would be software. Sega had not just console development teams. It could also port its successful arcade games into consumable home versions. Within a relatively short time period, the Dreamcast had one of the most memorable libraries of any games console. Games that couldn't be found on other systems. Within its first 6 months in the United States, the Dreamcast outperformed the Sega Saturn's lifetime console sales. As fast as the Dreamcast moved, however, it could not avoid the PlayStation 2, launched worldwide in the year 2000. Despite selling almost 3.5 million Dreamcast units that year, Sega decided that enough was enough. In early 2001, the Dreamcast was discontinued. Sega shuttered its console business, deciding to become a third-party developer and publisher. It is no coincidence that the Dreamcast died 3 months after the PlayStation 2's American launch. Yet Sega itself bears full responsibility for killing the Dreamcast. In their pursuit of a loss-leading sales strategy, Sega spent money it did not have and could not afford to lose. Console makers have almost always followed the same principle when selling a console: lose money on every unit sold. Profits would come not from the machine itself, but from software, accessories, and premium services. Sony followed this model with the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, but Sony's position as a global hardware manufacturer meant it could keep costs relatively low. It also had a vested interest in promoting the CD and DVD formats. Nintendo was the exception. It made a profit on every console sold, even when selling consoles at cheap price points. The Dreamcast cost millions to design and produce, and was then sold at a considerable loss. Sega was not Sony. Sega did not develop or fabricate the components of its hardware, so manufacturing costs were high. It also had little chance of making money on the GD-ROM, Dreamcast's proprietary storage medium. The Dreamcast's next-generation games cost millions of dollars to produce, sometimes with budgets so large it seemed impossible to break even. Sega's inclusion of a dial-up modem in every console increased manufacturing costs by $10 to $25, a long-term feature that would take years to become truly profitable. Compared to its rivals, the Dreamcast was an expensive machine to produce, and because of the PlayStation 2, Sega had to sell it cheap. Originally priced at $199 US, Sega reduced the Dreamcast's price to compete with the PS2. Sega even gave away free Dreamcasts with the purchase of a 2-year Sega Net subscription. These moves lost Sega an enormous amount of money, losses that piled on top of the debts of the Saturn years. Loss-leading strategies work in the long term. The executives at Sega knew they had little time to turn a profit. Sega's leaders set hard sales targets that would ensure the Dreamcast's viability. By the end of the 2000 holiday season, Dreamcast had undersold, despite selling almost 3.5 million consoles worldwide. Even with those numbers, Sega believed the Dreamcast could not survive in a market populated by refreshed competition. Executives arrived at a simple conclusion: the company could make more money selling software rather than hardware. Consoles, after all, were just an expensive means of delivering software to consumers. After the January announcement, Sega transformed into a third-party developer and publisher. Games released for the Dreamcast soon appeared on competing platforms. Sega prepared new projects for release on future systems. By the end of 2001, after a decade of schoolyard competition between Sega and Nintendo, the unthinkable happened. Sonic the Hedgehog appeared on a Nintendo console. The Dreamcast died, but Sega lived. Thanks for watching, and mahalo!